Hey everybody, this is Aaron from Aaron's Audio Corner, and today I'm going to be reviewing a lot of in-wall speakers at the more, I would personally consider, upper end of the price spectrum. Anything from about $500 to about $3,000 is what I'm going to be talking about today, and I've got a lot of notes to go through. I'm going to do the best I can to get through all of these. We're going to be talking about 7 different in-wall speakers. And it will take me a little bit of time, but I will try my best to speed this process along. Before I do that, let me read a couple things off because I tend to forget stuff. So I do want to give a shout out to a few different people. Number one, my patrons. You guys are the greatest. You guys and gals are the greatest, because without you, I wouldn't be able to afford to test all these speakers. I had to build a whole lot of baffles. And in order to build those, I had to spend a lot of money because MDF is getting really ridiculously expensive, or maybe it's been that way for some time and I've just been sheltered by it because I haven't had to buy some for a while. But I had to spend about $200 on MDF alone. And with the help of the patrons, that didn't really hurt me as much. I also have to give a shout out to John Sherman of the Screening Room AV. Now he has a shop in, I think 2 shops in Colorado Springs and 1 in Las Vegas. And John was the person responsible for sending me 2 of the speakers that I'm going to be reviewing today. I also want to give a shout out to Simply Stereo, and they are in the Chicago area. Now, I had to look it up online. It's from Palatine, Illinois, I believe is where they are located. And they also helped me out with getting me some samples for review. And without his help, I wouldn't have been able to review some of the more costly stuff that we're going to be talking about today. Also, Nick, who is a viewer, thank you, Nick, for sending me out some of the other stuff as well to help me round out this plethora of different in-wall speakers I'm going to be talking about. As part of my testing process, you know, ideally what I like to do is I like to take a pair of speakers, I like to set them up in my home theater room and my living room, I should say, and listen to them, then run measurements, compare my listening notes to the measurements, and then maybe do another listening session to, you know, check a few things out, equalize a few things, and see if I can maybe smooth out the response or get things to my liking more. And then that gives me more validation when I go to talk about the performance of the speaker to you. I can correlate my subjective listening with my objective measurements from my clipboard near-field scanner. However, in this case, I was only testing 1 speaker at a time. So testing in-wall speakers is kind of tough. I mean, imagine if you want to test an in-wall speaker, you've got to cut a wall, and that's going to mean some irreparable damage that you probably just don't want to do. So in my case, what I wound up doing was I wound up building an 8x8 baffle, and I actually inserted my 4-foot diameter baffle on top of that. And then that gave me a little bit more loading in the base, but really what that was for was just some sanity checks. That way, when I looked at the data, I could say, yeah, you know, I heard this or I heard that in the data. And if I didn't, then I could go back and look at the data, try to understand, was there an issue with the measurement process? And I think that's important, especially when you're doing these kind of speakers, because if you don't take the time to measure them properly, then you can have some erroneous results that could be leading you to the wrong conclusions. And in this particular case, I am measuring it with the clipboard near-field scanner. And then this allows me to get proper infinite baffle type results, as if you actually installed it onto a wall that was infinitely large. And then that gives you the proper base loading and the proper base output as you would if you actually put it on a large wall. I tested all of these speakers with the grill off and with the grill on. I'm going to be talking about the performance with the grill off because that's the best performance for all of the speakers. But if you want to see the data for both, it's going to be available on my website, aaronsAudiocorner.com. I'll have the link in the description below, so just go check that out at your own time. First up is going to be the B&W, what is this called? Let me see here. The B&W CWM 7.3 S2. Yeah, it's a long name. This is just the backing box. I wanted to show you this because it does come with the backing box. And a couple things I want to note here is that the backing box has some blanks that you can install right here at the bottom and at the top. And you can see that silver part right here, okay? Now these install via some little T-nuts. And once you install those, that actually makes the enclosure completely sealed. Now, they do have the option with an extension to put at the bottom of down here. And then you can essentially make the volume larger. Now in my testing, I wasn't able to add the extension. So what I did was I just opened up the box and let it vent into my 2 cubic foot baffle wall that I have test set up. And if you're curious about that baffle wall build that I tested all of this on, check the card up here. It's a quick intro to what I made. Now here we have the B&W, and this is the actual part that drops into the box that you just saw. You can see it does have a port. Right now I've got the foam stuffed in here because it does come with foam for you to stuff the port. You've got a tweeter, mid-range, 2 mid-woofers, slip it around to the back. And you can see what looks to be some really high quality parts. It's really a quite impressive looking speaker. However, unfortunately, this was one of the worst performers that I measured and that I heard in my listening. So let's talk about some of that. First thing we're going to look at is the ported response. And you see a very high Q peak on the mid-bass area around 125 Hertz. You also see a large dip around 2 to 4 kilohertz or so. You also see the high frequency range is boosted in treble quite a bit. I then reran the test and stuffed the port and actually knocked that high Q resonance on the lower frequencies down a few dB. And that made things sound a little bit better, but also measure a little bit better. But you're still left with that really weird suck out region around 2 to 4 kilohertz. So I thought, is the tweeter wired up out of phase? I mean, just from the factory. I actually took the speaker back apart. I reversed the wires, which I'm going to go ahead and say this too. They can't be reversed by accident. The way that the wires are ran, they're very short for one terminal and long for the other one. And it means that you can't possibly mess that up wiring them backwards. What I actually had to do was I had to use extension clips to connect one terminal to the wiring for the other terminal. And when I did that, this is what I got. And you can see that there's a pretty big difference in the response now. Instead of having that big suck out in the 2 to 4 kilohertz region, you've got a very narrow suck out right around, that's like maybe 5 to 6 kilohertz or so, give or take. Now, as far as what my notes say, I actually wrote down most sibilant of the bunch, mid-range guitar falls down in level, horizontal out to about 30 degrees, and boxy male vocals. The boxy male vocals makes perfect sense. The high Q resonance on the low frequency end. Most sibilant of the bunch, we see a boost around the high frequency area. Mid-range guitar falls down in level. So I'm wondering if that's that 2 to 4 kilohertz area that's got that suck out. It just kind of seems interesting. And when I say that it's horizontal out to about 30 degrees, what I mean is I put the speaker on the wall and I physically moved around the speaker, right? Trying to find where the response started to fall off, because I think it's important to know that when you install speakers on a wall, especially for a home theater type setup, you want to be able to have a similar sound between multiple seats in a home theater type setting. I'll also go ahead and mention this, that yes, there is high frequency boost. No, it's not there to counteract any screen loss that you may have from an acoustically transparent screen, because what I'm seeing here doesn't jive at all with the response effect from acoustically transparent screens. If you actually just go out and Google high frequency loss due to acoustically transparent screens, you can find a good amount of data out there that gives you an idea. None of those match the profile of the boost and the high frequencies that we're seeing here. Also, it's not designed to be listened to off axis. So you can't say that, well, these speakers are going to put up as a stereo, so it's a 30-degree triangle, so the response is going to be different. Well, that's true, but also consider in a home theater situation that the center carries the majority of the burden for the soundtrack and anything of that nature. Well, you're sitting right in front of the center in the sweet spot. So a poor design is a poor design. It really doesn't matter how you try to shake it up. In terms of distortion and compression, the distortion, to me, looks pretty good until you get to the low end. That's expected. It's not really a big deal. You're going to have more excursion with the smaller woofer, so distortion is going to go up a little bit more on the low end. The compression, to me, actually looks pretty decent other than the high frequency. So above about 7 kilohertz, your high frequency is just tanking off in terms of compression. That's going to limit the dynamic range of the speaker. Also, the retail for the speaker is about $2,100 MSRP. Next up, we've got the Focal 1000 Iw Lcr 6, and this is retailing $2,700 each. That's MSRP. Some of my notes, sibilant, and I say worse than the B&W. There is a negative 3 dB switch on here for the tweeter level, so you can switch that down. And doing that does help the sibilance and actually tames the high frequency somewhat, so I like that. Boomy. Yes, absolutely boomy. The data will show this. I'll talk about this in a second. Mid-range sounds recessed, and there is a plus 3 dB right down here. There's a 0, negative, and positive 3 dB for the mid-range, but doing positive 3 dB didn't really help any. And then I'll say the horizontal loses its hold at about 30 degrees. Okay, so now let's look at the data. Average sensitivity of about 87 dB, but good Lord, that bass and around 200 hertz, there's a strong resonance. Now, I actually took the speaker off the baffle wall because I thought maybe the resonance was from my baffle wall, but when I measured the speaker in quote unquote free air, that resonance was still there. So there is something internal to that enclosure or with the speaker itself that's causing a very weird resonance at around 200 hertz. And that's unfortunate because that's not something that you can simply EQ out. If you look at the shape of that dip and then that return peak from that resonance, that's just not something that you can fix with EQ. On the low end, you see that there is a bump of about plus 10 dB in the mid bass region, and that's from the enclosure. And what that's telling me is that enclosure is way too small for these drivers. Then you see the high frequency is at about plus 5 dB over the mid range. And my comment about the mid range sounding recessed, well, I think that's why I heard that, because the mid range is actually, you know, kind of smooth from about maybe 400 hertz to about 3 kilohertz or so. But when you compare that to the mid bass and the high frequencies are plus 5 dB, the bass is plus 10 dB. That's not a good design. And in my opinion, it's hard for me to recommend a speaker that performs like that because there's so many things that cannot be fixed with simple equalization. I will say that the compression in the mid-range looks good. The distortion actually looks pretty good too, but the compression on the very low end is also problematic, and it ramps up significantly higher than what I would find acceptable. So, okay, you know. Next up is the Kef Ci 3160 Rl Thx, and this one retails for $2,000 each. I said neutral tonality, sounds practically the same even at 45 degrees, and that there is a broad bump in the mid bass area. So when I say neutral tonality, I mean through the mid range to the high frequency area. If you look, you can see that there is no backing on the speaker, so there is no back box. You can buy amplified, but that's not stuff that I really care about. The overall look and aesthetic of the speaker is pretty cool. You can see it's got a nice shiny fascia on it. And then we've got Kef's typical great, well done design with their concentric mid-range and tweeter down here. So this gives you a really good point source response. This is the speaker, and that's the backside of the speaker. In terms of response, this is one of the smoother speakers of the in-wall speakers that I've measured so far. Like I said, there is a broad bump in the mid-bass area, but that can be EQ'd down. That's not a resonance or anything like that, so you can knock that down via EQ. It has a mean sensitivity of about 87.3. In terms of output, the distortion at 96 dB looks pretty dang good, and the compression also looks really good. This may be the best or one of the best in terms of actual output capability, which, you know, honestly, it kind of surprised me. Some of these other speakers have larger or more than the woofers that this Kef has, but the Kef does better at higher output volumes and is the more linear one of the ones we've just discussed. Martin Logan, $3,000 for the single speaker. It is fully enclosed. You can see the back is on there, so cool. It's got their little AMT type tweeter, dual mid-range, dual mid-bass. How did it sound? I actually wrote this in my review. I said, in short, it's rare that I make a do not buy recommendation. This is one of those instances. This is the most nonlinear speaker I think I've measured, not just out of in-wall speakers, but maybe overall. And I'm not picking on Martin Logan. This is the first Martin Logan speaker that I've actually tested on this channel. I've heard Martin Logan speakers in the past, never really had an issue with them per se, but the performance for this speaker at $3,000 for the single one, again, it's rare that I make a do not buy recommendation. This is a do not buy speaker, and let me tell you why. I said the speaker sounds dull, mids are recessed, no attack, only mid-range stands out, only lower mid-range stands out. Speaker is easy to pinpoint and doesn't get lost in the sound field. Now, look at the non-linearity of this response. Now, the average sensitivity is about 88.1 dB. The mid bass is about, I'm going to say maybe 6 or so dB above that level. But more than that, just the speaker itself is all over the place in terms of tonality and timbre. I mean, some things sound hot, other things sound dull. It's just a very mismatched overall sound for this speaker. In terms of distortion, it's okay through the mid-range, but naturally on the mid-bass area and below that, it starts to ramp up. In terms of compression, it's okay, but there's some issues in the higher frequency area, especially like the 2 kilohertz area. And then on the low end, there's a lot of extra distortion that's ramping that enhancement up a good bit. Now, having said all of that, the one thing about this speaker that I'm seeing from the data is that it should take well to EQ within reason. But to me, with a speaker like this, by the time you hammer it down with EQ, I mean, what's the point? I think, why not just go out and buy a better speaker? Now we've got this little Miller and Creasel IW 150. Retail MSRP was $2,100, but I don't think it's made anymore. I think it's been discontinued. I did find them online for around $1,000, and that was new in box condition. So I'm just mentioning that if you're interested in the speaker, that's kind of what I'm seeing out there online. As far as what I heard, somewhat neutral above the mid-bass region, above about 300 hertz, some lower vocal resonance, and then I said data shows a plus 6 dB bump centered on 150, which backs up what I heard. When moving to the side of the speaker, there's a hole in the sound on one side, but not on the other, which is not totally unexpected because look at this layout. It's not symmetrical. And what I mean by not symmetrical is there's 2 woofers on the side of the tweeters, but there's not 2 woofers on the other side of the tweeters, right? And if it were totally symmetrical, then you would expect the sound to be the same as you move from side to side. But since it's not, then you probably within reason can expect the sound to not radiate the same from side to side. And that presents a problem when it comes to placement and installation because people sitting to one side of the speaker are going to hear a different sound than somebody sitting to the other side of the speaker. And then reflections get involved from the side walls, and then that changes things. And for that reason alone, I probably wouldn't recommend the speaker. But having said that, the actual performance of the speaker really isn't that bad. It's just that the sound field is so asymmetric that it does some weird things in the imaging. So let's talk about the data. And what I see in here is an average sensitivity of about 88.2 dB, a boosted up treble region, but not as boosted as I've seen. And then we also still have the boosted mid-bass region, which is just a common trait I'm seeing with every stinking in-wall speaker. They've all got a boost on the low frequency. And I don't really understand why that's the case, because once you put the speaker in a wall, that boost is going to remain there. And any additional output is going to be added to that boost, but also the lower frequency. So it's really not going to change the profile of the speaker. And we know that because that's what I have. I have in-wall measurements. I wish companies wouldn't do that. Like, put a lower Q woofer in these cabinets. Quit putting what I assume is high Q, large VAS woofers in a, relatively speaking, small cabinet, because that bumps up the resonance or bumps up the mid bass and creates a more sound. I mean, it just lights up lower vocals, especially lower male vocals. And depending on where that bump in the mid bass is, it's going to light up lower female vocals. Now, you can fix that via EQ. You can just drop that down if you want to. But here's my thing about fixing stuff with EQ. Unless you're manually going in and making those adjustments, then your auto EQ and your AVR is trying to figure out what's the speaker and what's the room. And it can't. Let me just go ahead and tell you right now, it can't make that determination because you're not telling it anything different. You're just giving it a sound field. It doesn't know where it comes from. It doesn't know how it originates. So having said that, then your AVR is trying to say, well, let me change this. Let me change this. And it's changing different profiles based on the room modes and the speaker's response. And it's just a wreck. Get a good speaker that doesn't have those issues to begin with. And if you want to add it back in, knock yourself out. Go ahead. But let's not buy speakers with a high Q mid-bass bump that just increases resonance in the vocals and makes them sound really boomy and muddy. That's a no-go. So that's my plea to manufacturers as we continue, or as you continue to make more speakers. Don't do that. Now we've got the Revel W 893. MSRP is $1,100 each. So this is one of the more budget-friendly ones of the in-wall speakers that I'm testing in this roundup. And here's the back of it. So this is not a closed back speaker. This is a stick it in the wall, bolt it up, and then the wall becomes the volume, which I think is actually one of the reasons why this is one of the better speakers in terms of the low frequency. There's not a high Q bump there because it's not in a really small enclosure. I'm saying no noticeable tonality issues other than a harshness, excuse me, a sharpness in the upper mid-range, and I'm questioning 2 to 4 kilohertz, and sure enough, it actually shows up in the data. We'll see that. Horizontal to about 50 degrees, and there was actually a surprisingly deep soundstage, and I noticed that with some of the other in-wall speakers too. And why do I say surprisingly? Because when I think of depth, I think of the sound that maybe hits the back wall and then comes forward, and I know that's not always the case, but sometimes that's what gives the sense of depth, is that reflection off the back wall, whether that's true or not. That's kind of how my mind thinks of it. When I plugged the speaker in, this was the first one that I tested for my listening test. It had a surprisingly deep soundstage to it. And I thought, well, that's unexpected. So just for what it's worth, I thought that was kind of neat. The data shows pretty smooth response here, but I do see around 3.5 kilohertz, a bump in the response, which I find interesting. And then in terms of compression, got some weird high frequency stuff going on there, bringing that down. And then the low frequency stuff below, I'd say about 80 hertz or so, is going to be a problem. So I find the high frequency stuff really interesting. I'm not sure what's causing that. I think that's going to limit your dynamic range in the high frequency area. But overall, I think this is probably one of the speakers that I can more easily recommend, just giving its overall performance for the price. And then there's also a few adjustments that we have here on the front. I do provide what those adjustments do on my website, but we're not going to get into it right now. And now we've got the smallest speaker of the bunch, the Revel W 553L. It's $495 MSRP each. And look at this. This is a little baby speaker. And then flip it around, you can see that there is no closed back. So yay. What do we expect when we see it doesn't have a closed back? Not a big resonance in the mid bass. What do we get? Not a big resonance in the mid bass. I think in general, what I'm going to wind up recommending to people is, if you're looking at a new construction home, then make the wall behind the speaker sealed up. Use some silicone, whatever you need to between braces. Give it enough room to breathe. So let's just say 2 cubic feet. That's the number that I'm just going to say, right? Don't buy a closed back speaker. I know that sounds like a great idea. I would recommend that you build your own enclosure into the wall and then mount the speaker to the wall. And the reason I say that is because you've seen, out of all this data, the one common theme that we're seeing here is that closed back speakers have a lot of resonance in the lower vocals, and that's a problem. Not going to go on another rant, just mentioning that again. What do I say about this response? Fairly neutral. Mid-range sounds slightly thin at times. And then I say horizontal out to about plus or minus 50 degrees. So, okay, neat. Also, there is a tweeter level bump here on the front, so you can change the tweeter level. Now let's talk about the data. I said the mid-range sounds slightly thin at times. And then I also wrote in my notes, after looking at the data, I wondered if this is due to the bass region bumped up about 1 to 2 dB. Now, it's not a lot, and it's a very, very broad Q, but that bass region is bumped up just a little bit relative to the mid-range. So I wondered if maybe that's why I thought that the mid-range sounded a little bit thin. Knocking this bass down to even that out, that's not a problem at all. I mean, that's a parametric EQ of about Q of maybe 1 or 2, knock down 1 dB, and you're done. Center at about maybe 200 hertz, 300 hertz or so, and you're done. That's probably the easiest EQ fix that you'll see out of all these speakers that I've tested so far. The compression, however, does some weird stuff again at higher volume, and I'm wondering what's going on with this particular tweeter. Is this the same one that's used in the W893? I don't know, but I'm seeing some similarities in terms of the compression that I wonder if that's due to the tweeter itself, but I'm not really sure. And then below about 80 hertz, again, we start to increase in compression. I'm not really surprised at that. Given the size of the speaker, I would still recommend it for its price. I think, honestly, if I were trying to build a surround sound system with in-wall speakers in a home theater and I was on a moderate budget, I think this is probably the one speaker that I would go for side surround speakers. It has good horizontal response, pretty wide, about plus or minus 45 to 60 degrees, depending on what frequency you're talking about. The vertical response is actually still pretty good until about maybe 10 to 20 degrees. So you got some variation in height there with placement. So it's not a big deal. And since it's playing surround sound, you don't really have to worry about it having dynamic range issues. Some of what we saw in the compression results. I think I like the speaker for a surround speaker the most. Now that's it for all of these speakers that I've tested. And remember I mentioned that I've done the JBL SCL6 before. I think the JBL SCL6 is probably the best in-wall speaker that I've measured so far in terms of just overall quality. The Kef 3160 is, to me, right up there with it, but I haven't had a chance to compare the data side by side. I would expect that there's going to be some give and take there, and I think it's going to depend on what you personally are looking for. The vertical response window of the JBL is going to be a lot more narrow than the Kef, so that's one huge advantage on the Kef's behalf. But everything else is kind of up to you as far as what you think. That the distortion and the compression, both of them are really good, and the response linearity of both of them are pretty dang good as well. The Revels are also, I think, really good buys if you're looking for something in that range. The Martin Logan, that's a pass. The Bowers and Wilkins, that's a pass. And the Focal for me is a pass. And what I find very interesting is that the ones that are most expensive, the ones with the more heritage in their name, or maybe I would think more heritage in their name, are the ones that I didn't like the sound of and that measure probably the worst out of the group. And this channel isn't about negativity. This channel isn't about telling you bought the wrong thing. This channel is simply about providing you with information and educating you to make purchase decisions that make sense for you. So if you own any of the speakers that I didn't necessarily care for, that's okay. We can still be friends. But if you are shopping for speakers and you are considering those, I would urge you to try to get a demo of those in some way if you can. I don't know if that's feasible, but if you can, I would urge you to do that, because based on what I heard and based on what I see in the data, I'm not really impressed with the overall performance of those speakers, especially given their price. Again, I want to thank all of my patrons for helping me out. I want to thank Simply Stereo. I want to thank John Sherman. And I want to thank Nick for also helping me get some of these speakers. I didn't pay for any of these. I was just donated all these, or loaned these, I should say. And I wasn't given these by any manufacturers. Nobody paid me to review any of this stuff. This is all a community effort. And I'm truly grateful and appreciative of being able to have this opportunity to present you with data. It's been a 2-month process. It's cost me a lot of time. If I had hair before, I wouldn't have had it now. But since that wasn't really an issue, you can't tell, but I am wore out, and I'm happy to get rid of all these freaking speakers and move on to something else. And with that said, if you don't mind, if you're interested, I will put an affiliate link of a few different websites to Audio Advice, Crutchfield, Amazon. If you're interested in buying anything from them, please use one of my affiliate links. They're just generic links, but anything you buy from an AVR to underwear on Amazon, doesn't matter. That will help me get about 4%, and that helps me to offset some of my costs that you see here, such as the lighting that I have to buy just to light up my ugly mug. And that's it for me. I really do hope you appreciate it. Hope you learned something. I will talk to you all later. Peace.